Hey everybody, my name is Tardigrade. As a celebration for reaching 1,000 subscribers, we're going to take a look back at the most difficult custom maps I have uploaded to my channel. Custom maps I've played on Tank Run, Hard 20 Survival, Special Delivery, Hard 16, or just plain old campaign are all qualified for this list. Even though, spoilers, most of the maps on this list will be from two particular mutations. Keep in mind, this list is biased as I don't play all of these maps on the same mode, so these rankings are definitely apples to oranges. And I won't be including the revisit playthroughs of these maps, only their first gameplay. And this list isn't set in stone as I'll potentially play even harder maps out there. And I'll say this right now, just because these maps are hard doesn't mean they're bad. In fact, some of my favorite maps are on this list. Anyway, on to the list. Just cut. Alright guys, coming in at number 10, shut up. Glubtastic 3 on Special Delivery, 8.5 hours. We know we're in for some shit when this map is only at the beginning of the list. Glubtastic 3 reigns supreme as the hardest map in the series, not only because of the hair-pullingly frustrating train chapter and final boss, but also because, unlike the 4th and 5th maps of the series, there were no checkpoints in any of this map. We fuck up towards the end of a chapter? Do it all over again. The first chapter was a little dicey because of the Germa boomers. The second chapter was long, with many quests we had to take to open the bridge, and try not to crash and burn the vehicle on the way to the safe room. The third chapter was pretty scary, with that giant face getting closer and closer to us, and faster the more progress we made. The fourth chapter was really tough because we were always sandwiched between that tank and a bunch of special infected behind us. But the fifth and sixth chapters contributed more than half of the overall time we spent on this map. In the fifth chapter, all four of us needed to absolutely lock in to even have a chance. This chapter was made even more relentless by the fact that there were no checkpoints, like I mentioned, meaning every attempt was usually about 10 minutes. And as for the sixth chapter, that was the most unforgiving chapter of all. Special infected spawned from everywhere while we needed to fight multiple taints and dodge lasers from that even gianter face thing that incapacitated us in only a couple hits. After about 3.5 hours on just this chapter alone, I threw in the towel and just turned on God mode for everyone. It was clearly not made for a mode as unhinged as Special Delivery, but I'm too stubborn.
Number 9.
Days Repeat. 9 hours on Special Delivery. Nope, I didn't use a filter. The whole map is in this noir style. From the flashing lights to the monotonous gameplay, this map proved to be an enormously difficult task on Special Delivery. It pulled all the moves to stress us out: taints, witches, and death traps. And they indeed made the map much more grueling to get through. As soon as we hit the switch in the beginning of the first chapter, we were thrown right into a pile of special infected, followed by some spikes we needed to jump over. Once we got past that, we needed to wait for a path to open while fending off more special infected. Once the path opened, we had to go up these really steep stairs in a dark-ass hallway where we couldn't see a bloody thing, let alone the special infected. But clearly that part's too easy, so there were some doors once we finally got up the stairs that could spawn taints or witches if we opened them. To top this chapter all off, of course the safe room door couldn't just, open when we clicked on it. I mean, that's fine, it can open whenever it wants. We'll just fight a whole other fucking tank while we wait. And to make matters worse, the second chapter was like 99% the same chapter. It was literally just a copy-paste of the first one. There were some tiny changes, like the song that played in the previous one was like distorted, but who cares? The third and fifth chapters were much easier, but the fourth chapter managed to be harder than the first two chapters combined. There were narrow hallways with lots of blind spots, sentries everywhere, and merciless special infected that were dead set on not letting us progress more than 5 feet per minute. That one ladder in particular was arguably the most annoying moment I've ever experienced playing Special Delivery. There was barely any room to shoot the infected up there without accidentally shooting one of our teammates that was trying to climb up. And at some point after climbing up the ladder, everyone's pain went up by 150 or more. Fortunately, there was a way to make it to the end without dealing with any more special infected in front of us, except for maybe a taint or witch from the director. There was a very brief moment where special infected spawned from behind us instead of in front of us, and if someone stayed at just the right spot on the ladder, the special infected from behind would be stuck below them. Of course, this still wasn't free because of that one possible tank or witch that I mentioned earlier, and that one fucking sentry that I hate. Ironically, the 5th chapter, which had the most taints and witches in it, was one of the easier chapters in the map. Most if not all the non-boss special infected were stuck behind the doors, so we only had to deal with the taints and witches in question. Nonetheless, this map still managed to be half an hour harder than Bloodtastic 3. Number 8? Buried Deep. 9 hours on Tank Run. Every chapter was challenging, but the 2nd chapter in particular was responsible for more than half of the time we spent on this map. Most of this chapter was narrow with taints that always spawned in the most inconvenient spots. But, just like Days Repeat, there was a way to get the taints to spawn from behind us, and staying above the ladder next to the gate did just the trick. As long as someone stayed in the taint's line of sight, most of them didn't die. But even in the best case scenario of all 8 taints spawning behind the gate, and none of them spawning ahead, that didn't last long anyway because there was an elevator where everyone, including incapacitated teammates, had to be right next to it to even start. So sadly, that one person who volunteered to stay back near the gate, with all 8 taints, had to die anyway for us to even start the elevator event, and we had to deal with taints during that event anyway. And when, or if, we survived that event, there was likely a taint or two waiting for us once the elevator reached the top. A pipe bomb was pretty much mandatory to have to get past those taints, and even when we got past those taints, there was another one that spawned eventually, in the hallway with the boarded up door. The 3rd and 4th chapters were slightly easier, but still took more time on their own than most whole maps I've played on Tank Run. We managed to complete the 1st and 5th chapters in only a couple tries, but I definitely feel like there would be another universe where those would have taken a while too. Only one custom map we played on Tank Run managed to be even harder than this one. And number 7? Fallen. Also 9 hours on Tank Run. From the moment I learned about this map a decade ago, to first playing Tank Run half a decade ago, I knew if I ever played this map on Tank Run, it would be a big contender for a list like this. All of the cramped spaces, the taints that either spawned too close to us or at a place where they could shortcut to us while another tank auto-spawned near them, made this map one of the hardest Tank Run experiences I've ever had, to this day. In the 1st and 3rd chapters, we once again used the good old wait in a god spot for 8 taints to be stuck next to us, and one person stays while the rest of us go to the safe room strategy. The 4th chapter, however, was so impossible to get through legit because of the skinny ledges and the zigzaggy path that once again let the taints use shortcuts to get to us, that we ended up using a shortcut ourselves. I usually don't like using shortcuts that skip a big portion of a chapter that the author worked very hard on, but this pushed me to my absolute limit because of how constantly narrow it was, and how the taints were always in the most inconvenient spots. However, none of these chapters quite matched the utter insanity that was the 5th chapter. Layout-wise, this chapter was shorter than the other ones, but that skinny round air vent with the low gravity mechanic was the most annoying Tank Run moment I've had in my life. We already knew there was no shot we could complete this just by staying at the bottom the whole time, so we used the low gravity to our advantage and stayed at those little ledges at the top. But of course, that couldn't last, because there was always a tank or two that was pushed up by some malevolent force right to where we were, so they could delete us out of existence. And it was hard to tell where exactly those ledges ended, so if we moved even a little bit in the wrong place, there was a chance we slipped off and fell back to the bottom where all the other tanks were. I genuinely hope I don't play a chapter on Tank Run that's this insufferable again. Number 6. Silent Hill, Other Side of Life, clocking in at 9.5 hours on Special Delivery. The longest custom map I have recorded on my channel, we meet again. We played the enhanced version of this map, which meant there were added keys that were each in RNG locations. Oh joy. While the first, third, and fifth chapters were scary because of the random key locations and wide open space, we somehow didn't struggle in those chapters nearly as much as I expected. The second chapter, however, was as long and difficult as I feared. The key locations and events weren't any different from the original version, but both versions of this chapter were dark, narrow, and the successful attempt on the video alone was almost a whole hour long. Line spots, backtracking, darkness, and scarce supplies were the name of the game here. That forest section was the concentrate of all of this, with the added danger of being pushed off the edge to our deaths. And it was so dark from that filter that I could actually see better if I was black and white. But Eugene found a way to change his monitor to where he could actually see normally without the filter. I mean, I wanted to record the map as is, but it was definitely tempting given how brutal that particular section with the foliage was. And that was only at about the halfway point. Next, we had two mazes, a scripted tank section, and some narrow staircases to finish it off. I never thought I'd see the day where we actually completed that chapter, but it felt good to say the least. Even though I made up a checkpoint about halfway through the chapter, but anyway. The sixth chapter was maybe the runner-up in terms of difficulty on this map, but it was still child's play compared to the infamous second chapter. Number 5. Absolute Zero on Special Delivery, taking 11 hours. I think the easiest chapter was the first, and that took about an hour and a half, and it was prone to crashing. The other chapters didn't crash, but they were a pain to complete. Each chapter was a little long, where it felt like the layout was specifically designed to make the Special Infected feel like they were straight out of Versus. The second chapter had a tough event where we had to use a minigun to break the pillars, and of course, the Special Infected kept spawning while we tried to do this. Later, there was a section with puddles, and the sides were covered in foliage. Later, there was another event where we needed to start a generator and wait for the doors to open. When they opened, a tank spawned behind us, and the best course of action was to run to the elevator at the end of the section. Of course, only one person made it to the elevator on the successful attempt, and there were a couple of Special Infected waiting for them on the top. The third chapter was even more stressful, with an elevator that slowly ascended, while Special Infected could drop down on us from the many vents the author conveniently provided them with. When we made it to the top, a scripted tank spawned, while the other non-boss Special Infected were still ambushing us. A couple ladder climbs and narrow corridors later, we were in a more wide-open section, but it had ice visits. Yay! The fourth chapter gave us a few minutes of respite, where no Special Infected spawned, but they spawned later on, and the ending in particular was the hardest part. The fifth chapter was a little easier than the third, but a couple scripted tanks spawned while, in typical Special Delivery fashion, the non-boss Special Infected were still spawning. A little later on, there were a few wandering witches where we had to be really careful not to shoot them, while still shooting the Special Infected that were clobbering us. When the escape sequence started, we had to be careful because the military tank that was helping us out, and that rescue airplane could fucking kill us. I remember the first time I played this map, I walked under one of the plane blades and died instantly. I rage quit the map that day. Number 4. Silent Hill on Special Delivery, 11 hours total. This was one of those maps where we just couldn't seem to catch a break. It felt like a majority of our attempts we were just getting destroyed at the beginning of the chapters. Puzzles, constant Special Infected from around the corners, and scarce supplies throughout the map, including the safe zones. The third chapter tripped us up a lot. We had to backtrack a lot because of the puzzles, and the Special Infected could spawn from any direction. There were quite a lot of blind spots since we were indoors, and there was a scripted tank later on. The fourth chapter was outside and it was more wide open, but it was even more difficult. And I'm going to say this now so I don't repeat myself. After the second chapter, there were no kits at the beginning of any of these chapters. Well, aside from the finales, but still. Even when we decided to play this chapter starting with 100 health and just rush it, it was still brutal as hell, and I ended up making a checkpoint later on anyway. The 6th chapter was an even more difficult version of the 3rd chapter. Even getting past the start was an absolute pain in the ass, and there were a lot of scripted hunters when we collected those stone plate things. When we made it to the bottom floor and unlocked the safe room in the floor above us, Special Infected spawned back where we were trying to go. Now, the 7th chapter was the hardest part of this map, no question. It was the longest, supplies were very scarce, there were a lot of death traps, and there was a scripted tank at the end, and the non-boss Special Infected didn't stop spawning while we fought him. Now, the 8th chapter would have been easier if I played with one more person, but climbing down the ladder and dealing with the scripted boomers and hunters on the way to the safe room probably would have tripped us up regardless. The 9th chapter was pretty hard, but we found a way to get the Special Infected stuck behind a bush. And if someone stayed next to the Special Infected while someone else went to the tower, they didn't despawn. The 10th chapter was a little easier, but the 11th chapter was just like the 3rd and 6th. Once again, the beginning was absolute trauma because of the Special Infected not giving us a single break and the many ways to fall to our death, including that ladder that the bots tended to fall off. And the narrow, backtracky puzzle layout resulted in the Special Infected spawning from any direction they wanted. The finales were fortunately the easiest part of the map, but this was still overall a pervasively stressful map to play. Number 3. Questionable Ethics, also taking 11 hours on special delivery. At first, it was hard to believe the first Questionable Ethics map was the hardest, by a wide margin at that, but considering how long these chapters were with many ways to get team wiped in a matter of seconds, it made more sense the more I thought about it. The first chapter was the quote-unquote easiest, but it still took an hour and a half to complete. The 2nd chapter, though, it was arguably the hardest chapter I've played on special delivery. The beginning was no problem, but everything went to shit in the next section. This section had the single biggest reason this chapter was the crowning hardest: the bells. In special delivery, car alarms can spawn taints if you trigger them. In this case, the bells functioned exactly like car alarms, and there were a lot of them. In the next section, we had to fight 2 scripted taints in case we somehow didn't already fight 20 of them in the previous section. Another notable section was going through the water while trying not to get crushed by these hydraulic press thingies. And the part right after it was the absolute worst. We had to go up a few ladders that the Special Infected were very inconsistent at climbing down. And there were a lot of bells everywhere. On every attempt, we shot at least 1 bell or 2. So we decided to shoot all of them. The majority of the time we spent on this chapter was going back and forth, waiting for the taints to die. But wait, there's more. We still had the final section, where we had to parkour down a bunch of pipes while dodging cars that fell from the ceiling. Oh, and, fight Special Infected too, of course. And when we made it to the bottom, we better have either brought a gas can or remembered that code from earlier, because if not, then... well, fuck. The 3rd chapter was easier, but definitely a close second to the previous chapter. Squid Game style water sections, dodging lasers, fighting taints in cramped and sloped spaces, fighting more taints, the usual stuff to expect. The 4th chapter took about as much time as the 1st, but it was terrifying. Most of the holdout area was a water section, with the return of those hydraulic presses. The escape sequence was even crazier. And that ending was the most cinematic moment in my career. And the second hardest custom map I've played is Wild Ride on Hard 16, taking 13 hours. Imagine an 85-minute long map where almost every waking second of playing it feels like the entire team could be annihilated at any moment. Well, you don't have to, because this map on Hard 16 was that exact experience. The first 2 chapters were almost as long as the 2nd chapter of Other Side of Life. And the 1st chapter in particular managed to be even harder than that Other Side of Life chapter. Even though we didn't play on realism, there were no rescue closets in any of the 3 chapters. It was already hard enough whenever that army of special infected spawned, but a horde seemed to love spawning from behind us at the exact same time. That was pretty much an ongoing problem every 1 to 2 minutes. The best attempt we could manage was at about 13 minutes in at that sewer closet section before we used our own checkpoint. And whenever I'm creating a checkpoint on a certain chapter, I usually go to the ending safe room of the previous chapter so I can set up the items we had or specific health. But in this case, this was the first chapter. There was no previous chapter. So I finally said, fuck it, and spliced another attempt where we made it further through the chapter but with reduced special infected. As we progressed further through the chapter, in many moments where I feel like we would have died with 16 special infected, there was one section that was notably laggy as hell, the notorious boat section. Believe it or not, this was actually laggier than the 4th chapter of Days Repeat. Later on, still in the first chapter by the way, there was an event where we needed to wait for a platform to turn so we could walk to the other side. When said platform stopped, we'd better not have fallen in the water, otherwise we were soft-locked until we went idle. And even when we went idle, teleporting to the other teammates took quite a while. And after that was another event where we had to fight all the non-boss special infected, the hordes, and scripted tanks in a giant arena. Obviously, we weren't crazy enough to stay in the middle of that carnage, so we held out near that platform in the back so the infected were in everyone's same line of sight instead of coming from every direction around us. Of course, we had to make sure not to fall back in that water again. And when we finally finished that long event, there was a hall to the safe room where one final special infected ambush could spawn. You still here? Because we got 2 more chapters left. The second chapter was slightly less painful, but the descent into the water, giant tunnels, generator gauntlet event, and climbing up the long staircase were brutal to say the least. And once again, I resorted to a Frankenstein monster creation of different attempts to tie this all together. We could only muster the first and last couple minutes of this chapter in Hard 16. The third chapter was the least torturous, only taking about 3 hours. Hooray! It was much shorter, but it was still long by most custom map standards. At some point, there's a metal detector that, when we walked under it, spawned a horde, but we found a way to jump on the fence and skip that part completely. I mean, we still had to deal with the special infected, but at least there wasn't a giant horde alongside them. The final gauntlet, though, was pretty unforgiving. We had to fight more hordes, but we had to be extra careful not to walk on certain tiles of that walkway, because some of them broke off, and if someone fell, they were back where they did that metal detector event skip and had to go through like 5 minutes of level to get back to us. And the final part was another run up the stairs and horde rush through the water. Tank spawned as we ran through another walkway, but eventually there was a safe room and we finally beat the map. After going through all this, I feel like the author turned off mutations and scripts for a reason. Princess Lady Rain helped modify the files for this map to allow us to play on mutations and use admin to add more special infected. But if I started that regular campaign series around the time I played this map, I definitely would have played it on default instead. This map put us through quite a lot, but there was one map that managed to be even more difficult. Before we get to number 1, this was a really competitive list, so I wanted to drop some quick honorable mentions. And the #1 hardest custom map I have ever played is Contra Z version 0.6 on special delivery, taking 16 hours total. And here we are, the ultimate challenge on the list. Despite the author having enough mercy to provide us with infinite ammo, survivor-specific buffs, and built-in checkpoints for the boss fights, it was still the hardest map we have ever played. The first chapter had an option to play in first person, which we did in the successful attempt, but it had a default setting to where our view was in 2.5D mode, and that was way more difficult. While first person gave us the freedom to shoot the special infected at any area within sight like normal, we had less control than 2.5D if they weren't in the same layer as us. If a special infected was in the background, the only option was to wait for them to run into the foreground where we were to deal any damage to them. In addition to the special infected, there were laser cannons shooting at us and a mini-boss at the end. This chapter was already quite a hard experience, but it was only a mere warm-up of what the other chapters had in store. The other chapters were in familiar first-person territory, but they were much more insanely tough to complete. The second chapter had many sections of lasers shooting at us. There was also a force field between us and the lasers in these sections, so we couldn't progress until we shot every single one of those lethal blue shapes on the wall. Of course, this wasn't the only task we had on our plate, as special infected were creeping from both sides next to the lasers, and they could run through the force field. There were quite a few hallways, stairs, and vents we had to go through, with these occasional laser sections. The third chapter was way more wide open, but there were boulders and robots that could kill us in addition to the laser cannons. Falling in the water fortunately didn't insta-kill us, but they dealt a huge chunk of damage nonetheless and teleported us away from the rest of the team. The fourth chapter was similar to the second, aesthetic and layout-wise, but with a more Matrix vibe to it. Also, those bubbles could hurt us. Nice. The fifth chapter had bombs dropping on us, followed by vehicles and more robots shooting at us, and a snowstorm that pushed us back every now and then. The sixth chapter was actually the easiest because the special infected tended to get stuck in a lot of places, at least at the time we played this. Now these different sections and enemies along with the special infected were pretty tough. But I haven't even mentioned the hardest parts of this map. Allow me to introduce you to the bosses. The easiest one by far was in the 6th chapter, but the rest of them were straight up impossible. Imagine having to play the final boss from Bloodtasted 3 4 times over. That was how insanely stressful the bosses at the end of the 2nd through 5th chapters were. They were already crazy on their own, but to add insult to injury, the special infected still spawned while we were fighting these bosses. The 6th chapter was an exception, of course. We only had to fight the boss, and the boss was easy. Are you good at multitasking? Well, these bosses on special delivery will make you question if you actually are, because there was so much going on. Like the Master Sis boss, these bosses could incapacitate and kill us with ease, and they had a smorgasbord of ways to do so. Were we able to legitimately complete these bosses? Anticlimactically, no. We turned on God mode on the 2nd through 5th chapter ones after spending an average of 2 hours on each of them. I know there are harder maps out there on these modes that I haven't even tried, but I've got a life to live. About 5 months later, this remains the hardest custom map I've played out of all 400 plus I've recorded for this channel, and hopefully that record isn't broken for a while.
That was very poorly edited.
Whether you stuck around until this point, left because of my bad mic quality, or down to shot glass every time I said the word chapter, please don't try that by the way, I'm glad you stopped by to give this a watch. A huge thanks to my friends for their kindness and support through this journey, and kudos to a bunch of them who participated in these ridiculous challenges. And once again, thank all of you for making this 1,000 subscriber milestone happen. And I know this is a cliche to say, but none of this video would have been possible if it weren't for you. Remember to stay cool and stay safe, and I'll see you next time, Water Bears.